Hello and welcome back. In this video, we are going to take a look at the concepts related to identification. Let's start with the idea of identification. Before we start, just to set the context here, let's introduce two participants in our discussion. One of the participant is a job recruiter and the other participant is the candidate. These participants were involved in a transaction in a job interview where the candidate was interviewed for the role of security architect before and had secured the job earlier. Today, he makes a call to the recruiter and asks her if she can send the offer letter to xyz@gmail.com. Recruiter is not able to identify the caller and she rejects the request. So here is the case where the identification failure has happened. The recruiter is not able to identify the caller. Now, the candidate calls the recruiter again, and this time he makes the same request and he gives his name. So he says that, "Hey, I am Nasir. Can you please send the offer letter at xyz@gmail.com?" This time the recruiter checks her emails and the records and she finds that indeed Nasir was interviewed and he had secured the job. So she sends the offer letter back to Nasir. Now this is the transaction where we can say that okay, identification success has happened. So what we see here is that the concept related to identification has helped in the transaction. Now let's have a relook at the problems that we visited in the last lecture and how the identification is the answer to these problems. So the first problem that we had discussed in the last lecture also is that imagine you are the service consumer or the client, then how do you ensure that you are sending the data or the information to correct entity? And the answer is identification. To give you a small example, suppose you are doing online shopping where you have to send the credit card details in order to secure the purchase. So it is mandatory and it is required on our part to ensure that we are making the payment to the correct entity. We are sending the information to the correct entity. Then another problem is again, if we are the service consumer or the client, then how do you ensure that you are requesting data or information from correct entity? Just to give an example for this scenario, suppose you are a patient in a hospital and then you are asking the hospital to send the medical report. In this case, we must ensure that no one else is faking to be hospital from where you are requesting your medical reports. So we have to ensure that the other party involved in the transaction is the correct party that we want to connect to, and the identification helps us in this scenario as well. The third problem is, imagine you are the service provider and how do you ensure who is requesting access to the data or information? The answer again is identification. We must identify the consumer who is requesting data from us. So we see how identification helps us in all these three scenarios. So how do we define identification? We can say identification is the process of presenting an identity to a system. Basically, it is a claim to be something or someone. Identification occurs when a user or any subject claims an identity. So as a user, we have to claim an identity. So we claim the identity. Claiming identity is identification. It can be anything that can uniquely identify a subject. It can be anything that can identify you uniquely. There are many ways to carry out user identification. And the first is username. Another way to identify the user is via identity cards with picture and personal information on it to prove identity. With increasing number of cyber attacks, other new identification methods have been discovered. Biometrics is one of such an example, where fingerprint, retina scan, facial scan of the user can help us to identify a person. Now, when we talk in terms of system or application, there are other examples that can help us to identify a system or subject. IP address of computer can help us to identify the system. API key or client ID, when we talk in terms of application, then it can help us to identify the application who is requesting access to the information. Moving on, we can see how identification works in Gmail. So here in this page you can see this is the login screen of Gmail, and then if you want to test any random user, so what I did is that I just put a random user and just tried to log in and see if Google allow me to claim this identity. So basically here I am claiming an identity in the Gmail system, that is testing random user is the identity that I am claiming, and I'm just trying to request access here, but Gmail rejects my request and it says that okay, we couldn't find your Google account. So here is the case of the identification failure. It didn't allow me to log in, it didn't allow me to go forward because I could not claim an identity into the system. Now let's see the other example where I just went and claimed a random identity Gaurav.Kumar, which I don't know, I don't even own this identity, just I put it randomly. And what Gmail did is that it identified that okay, this Gaurav.Kumar is an identity in Gmail system. It allowed me to move forward and it is asking me to enter the password. So here is the case of the identification success. Though I don't know who is this Gaurav Kumar, I don't have really any idea. But here this is the example of client identification, and we see how server is doing the client identification based on the client's IP address. Now using the client's API key and client ID is another way to identify the client. So this is just another example to present client identification. Now this is an example where we see the client doing the server identification. So when the client is requesting data from the server, client is ensuring here that it is connecting to aws.amazon.com correctly. So here server presenting its domain name as server's identity. Domain name can be the another use case of identification. It can help you to identify the entity. We can see how this helps us to uniquely identify the entities, and we will see in the next few lectures that how SSL TLS certificates can help in identification, as certain certificate types bind identity to domain names. SSL certificates we will see further in this course, and we will learn how SSL certificates can help us in solving the problem related to identification. So I hope that clarifies and help you better understand identification concept, and that would wrap up the video. I hope this was helpful. See you in the next video. Thank you.